Hi guys, so recently I was at the British Motor Show and I was actually hosting an area called the Tech Hub. And at the Tech Hub we were discussing various things. We were looking at careers, but we were also looking at technology. We were looking at the future of motoring, and we were talking about electric vehicles and their equivalents, I suppose, ICE, internal combustion engine. And one of the sessions that we did over 3 days, Thursday, Friday and Saturday, was is it the end of ICE? And I was very honored and privileged to have some amazing guests and panelists on that session, and some very interesting points were raised. So is it the end of ICE? Is it the end of the internal combustion engine? I'm in an internal combustion engine right now. I'm in my 1989 BMW E30, straight 6 petrol engine. Is it the end of ICE? Well, apparently not, and I'll explain to you why right after this.
A brown car guy.
Right then, so as I said, the session we had was called, Is it the end of ICE? And of course the inference there is that electric vehicles have come along, EVs have come along, and we're obviously being pushed towards them by government legislation in terms of environment and climate. So the question is that, are they basically taking over? Does that mean this is it? This is the end? And don't forget, the argument is valid because or actually even the idea of discussing it is necessary and valid, because in the year 2030 we have a cutoff deadline proposed, I should say. Well, actually, to be honest, the government says no, it's definitely happening. In fact, just as recently as I think a few weeks ago, because there was discussion about, are we throttling back on net zero, and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was adamant that the 2030 deadline was definitely going to happen. And what I mean by 2030 deadline, I mean 2030 being the cutoff point for the sale of brand new petrol and diesel cars. So you would not be able to buy petrol and diesel cars brand new in 2030 anymore. You would be able to buy some hybrid cars, and the likelihood is that those hybrid cars would be plug-in hybrid cars rather than regular in-series hybrid cars. So there is a deadline of 2030. That's what the politicians are saying. But politicians are politicians. But the question is, so this is why it's a good time to be asking this question of whether or not, because don't forget, 2030 is 7 years away. That's it. So is it the end of ICE? Well, what about electric vehicles? Let's look at those first. What are the benefits of them? And there are many benefits of electric vehicles. I mean, they are in an urban setting. In a built-up urban setting, they're definitely a cleaner, better option. In terms of the local air quality, they're definitely a better option. They have some particulate emissions, but the particulate emissions, whilst they're slightly more when it comes to tire emissions, they are significantly less when it comes to braking emissions from brakes. And the reason for that is because they don't actually use the traditional brake setup as much as internal combustion engine cars do. And the reason for that is because they use mostly, well, we would term it engine braking in the old days, but they use their motor to basically stop the vehicle. This is why some of them have one pedal mode, for example. Electric vehicles, so they are cleaner in that sense. There's no emissions. They can be run electric. They are potentially, could be cheaper. If you have a home charging facility, they could actually be cheaper to run. So there are definitely some benefits to electric vehicles, and I think that they make a lot of sense for people living in an urban environment. And you can see the transition happening. The fastest rate of growth of the type of vehicles being sold is obviously for electric vehicles. We're coming up to, I think, around 1 million or so electrified vehicles now in the UK. But don't forget that we have a national car or vehicle population, I should say, of about 38, so let's call it 40 million vehicles on the UK's roads. So that's what we have. So when you look at the situation with electric vehicles, like I said, that in some situations they don't quite work. So for example, I've had messages on my YouTube channel from people that live, in the Scottish Highlands or places like that, far-flung places, And Scotland is beautiful, so you can't blame them for wanting to live in these remote areas to get away from everything. But, they actually said to me, they said, look, we talked to our energy company, and they said the cable that they have that supplies them with electricity is not actually thick enough to be able to manage. This is what they told me, so this is exactly what I'm quoting them. It's not actually thick enough to be able to manage the charging of an electric car. The nearest charging point to them is about 40 miles away, and they also need a 4x4. They need a 4x4 because of where they live, and because sometimes in adverse weather conditions they need a 4x4, a proper 4x4. I know a lot of electric vehicles are four-wheel drive because they have battery motors on the front and rear axles, but they're not necessarily 4x4 in the sense that they're not off-roaders. So this is a dilemma for them. So they said, well, it's an impossibility for us. We literally cannot do this. We cannot run an electric car. And then actually when you start to broaden the net, if you like, and even people on the panel, even people that were actually, EV proponents on the panel were admitting that, there are challenges to be faced. And some people are saying it's just an impossibility when it comes to haulage, when it comes to freight, road transport for freight. So I'm talking lorries and trucks and stuff like that. Small vans and stuff you can manage. So delivery vans around town, people like Amazon, wherever, these people are switching to EVs, and you are getting extended range hybrids, such as from the London Electric Vehicle Company. So the new London taxis, they're being available as vans. And those kind of things as urban delivery vehicles, they work quite well. But I'm talking about long distance haulage. I'm talking about, trucks and vans to transport goods over long distances. And what they're finding there is a lot of difficulty. In the sense that, the electric vehicles just aren't capable of lugging those loads that far without running out of charge very, very quickly. So this is a problem that they have. They run out of charge very, very quickly. Now, various solutions have been looked at. So, for example, in Germany, they tried overhead cables on motorways for lorries. And I think they tried them out. But the logistics, the infrastructure required to lay that out is just phenomenal if you think about it. So I don't know if that's viable. There's also the concept of underfloor charging points, so that you get basically wireless charging, induction charging from the ground as you're driving along. And a complete alternative has been like hydrogen power. So they look at hydrogen fuel for commercial vehicles. That's actually more viable because a lot of commercial vehicles will, because the main thing with hydrogen is the transportation and the refueling. That's the difficulties with that. But commercial vehicles go to a particular depot, a particular center where they will all recharge, or they'll stop at particular places where they could be recharged. But the problem is that, again, fundamentally there's an issue there. And that carries through into other industries as well. So if you look at, for example, the construction industry. So somebody was talking about the mining industry or stuff like that. And they said that, well, the vehicles that they're using, the amount of power that they need, the amount of cabling and infrastructure you'd have to lay down just to be able to get the power to the construction site to then charge those vehicles is completely unviable. It just doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. And then of course you move to the military, you move to the army. Can you imagine? You can't drive tanks and things around and then worried about where you're going to charge them. You can't. You'll continue to use diesel vehicles in that sense. You can't go to war on an empty charge. That's for sure. And you can't. And you talk about the first thing they attacked during a war is the infrastructure to cripple the enemy. So I mean, all you have to do is cut the power stations and cut the charging stations, and that'll be it. Nobody's going anywhere. So that war won't last very long either. And then of course you move to stuff like this, classic vehicles. And there's a big argument about classic vehicles. It's like, well, what do you do? Can you convert them to electric? So a lot, and I have reviewed quite a lot of these cars, and I'm not actually against them. I think particularly in the case or in the instance where you find that, if a classic vehicle is being fully restored, the engine is beyond dead or needs substantial work, and you go, well, okay, let's switch it to electric. Or in an instance where, the original car, actually the powertrain wasn't that good. And I gotta be honest, I got a confession to make. My all-time number one most loved car, as some of you will know, regular viewers will know, is the Lotus Esprit. It's my bucket list car. I gotta own one day. But if I look back to the original Esprit, the first, the S1, S2, whatever, and not so much the S3 Turbo was a heck of a thing, right? But the S1, and even the later models, the gearboxes were not great, let's be honest, and they didn't really have the power that they were supposed to have because they were envisaged with a V8, but because we had the Suez Canal crisis at the time, the petrol crisis at the time, this is the 70s, they ended up getting 4-cylinder engines. And so if you think about the fact that if somebody could come up with a light enough battery to work in an S1 Esprit, then actually an electric motor in there might actually be a better powertrain, because those cars were about the looks and they were about the handling. The handling, in fact, was so good. I'm going off on a tangent here, but the handling was so good on the S1 S3. That is the car that I loved and I fell in love with in the movie The Spy Who Loved Me. When the stunt driver on The Spy Who Loved Me tried to drive it the way they needed it to be driven, it was so ahead of its time in terms of its handling and dynamic ability that he couldn't actually do it. So famously, they had to use the test driver from Lotus who brought the cars. They asked him if he could drive it, and of course he could drive the wheels off it. So he knew what to do. He knew how to handle it and get the best out of that car, whereas the stunt driver couldn't, because that's how far advanced it was. So it makes sense here. So in certain cars it makes sense. But here's the thing. One of the panelists that we had was a guy from a company called Corriton. And Corriton, what they do is they basically specialize in developing e-fuels. So they're doing things like, net zero fuels, if you like. So it's still petrol, but it's net zero because they're extracting carbon back out of the air. And them and other companies extracting carbon back out of the air, or creating e-fuels, synthetic fuels, or biofuels. So all of these things are happening. And basically, he said, going forward, for classic cars and stuff like that, this is probably going to be the way forward. This is probably what we're going to be doing. This is how it's going to work. And I said to him, I said, well, what about these conversions for classic cars, converting them to electric vehicles? And he said, that's all fine and good, but the problem there is that when you have an older car, and I've said this so often, and I think it's still a fact, that when you have a classic car, when you have an older car, I always say the best car for the environment is an old car, right? And why do I say that? I say that because an old car has paid its carbon dues. What do I mean by that? I mean that it's already been all the stuff that you need to make a car. The carbon footprint of making and delivering a car has already been done. And it's done years of service, it's paid back its carbon dues, and now, the emissions on a classic car, the CO2 emissions on a classic car compared to a normal car, annual carbon footprint, you're talking about 4.5 tons or so, under 5 tons. With a classic car, because of the lower usage and stuff like that, you're talking about less than 600 kilograms. That's nothing. So these cars have paid their carbon due. It's just a case of keeping them going. Now, the good point that he made is that when you take an existing classic car and you put an electric drivetrain into it, then you've actually given it more carbon debt, because now you've put new stuff into it. So you've increased the debt on that car. So the batteries and everything, even if they're recycled, could have been recycled, or they could have been used elsewhere, but theoretically you are putting new bits into it. You've sort of almost hit the reset button on that car. That was an interesting point. I think there's certain nuances that we could get into, but I think it's a very valid way of looking at it. It's like, no, just keep them going as they are. And the sort of stuff that him and companies like his are doing in terms of providing these alternative fuels, which at the moment are very expensive in terms of production distribution, but surely will become more and more viable going forward, especially if more investment goes in and economies of scale increase, then I think it makes a lot of sense that that's the way to do it. Now the thing is that when you talk about the number of cars on the road, as I said, that we're coming up to like 1 million electrified vehicles, right? So the estimate that I found, the best estimate for 2030, is they reckon 8 million electrified vehicles to hit the road by 2030. So now remember what I said, 38 million vehicles we're talking about, 40 million vehicles, let's say, on the UK, out of which you're talking 8 million vehicles, right? So that's about 20% would actually be EVs. And so if you're saying 8 million vehicles, let's say 10 million. If we say the 40 million, we say 10 million are EVs, but that means the 30 millions are still internal combustion engine. And don't forget, we're talking vehicles, so not just cars, but like I said, when people are using them for emergency services, because that's another thing, emergency vehicles will still often need to be petrol or diesel. And like I said, the construction industry, the military, and what have you, the freight industry. So you're talking about 30 million vehicles still on the road that are going to be ICE. And when you think that, well, they will be replaced, when the technology will get better by that time, the battery packs will get better by that time, and they will replace, and they will surely very, very quickly disappear. Well, actually, not that quickly, because if you think about it, and we're down on sales annually in the UK, but like a good typical year for sales, vehicle sales in the UK, is about 1 million vehicles. So you're talking about 1 million vehicles a year, you're talking about 30 million vehicles still left, and 2030, 30 million ICE vehicles still left. That means you're talking another 30 years. You're talking another 30 years before you actually switch them all over to electric. That means you're not talking about, we're talking about 2060. There was another session, in fact I'll do another video on it. There was another great fascinating session that we did, which was what was motoring going to be like in 2050, and I'll do that in another video. But you know, there was an assumption on most of the panels that there wouldn't be any ICE vehicles around, but based on those figures, I think that actually we will still have ICE vehicles, you know, in 2060. That will still happen because there's physically no way of replacing them that fast. It's just actually not possible. So there you go. So I think that that's the reality of it. I think that ICE is going to be with us for a good while, and I think that the other, and this is probably another video as well, but just to touch on it briefly, this whole notion of whenever EVs are mentioned or whenever ICE is mentioned, you're either in one camp or the other camp. Many people have accused me of being, you know, anti-EV. And then when I talk about EVs, people are like, why are you talking about EVs? You don't like them. And I'm like, that's not true. You know, and I think that we have to raise the sophistication of the level of conversations that we're having regarding these cars, you know, because at the end of the day, I think we need to look at all solutions. I think it's very important for us to be looking at all solutions. And I think that you're in a situation where you go, okay, we have to accept that EVs and ICE vehicles will continue to coexist side by side for decades to come, out of necessity and out of the fact that it's simply not possible. It's simply not possible to replace all the vehicles, both in terms of needs and in terms of the source, the raw materials that we need to replace all of our vehicles with EVs. It's not. So I think we have to have a much more mature conversation about the fact that, you know, not all ICE vehicles are bad, not all EVs are bad, but the right vehicle for the right purpose in the right situation is what we should be looking at. And we should be looking at other opportunities as well, and other possibilities, such as hydrogen, and maybe something else, you know, who knows. But there are these videos circulating of people, I mean, to be honest, the notion of running a car on water has been circulating for, I think, 20, 30 years, you know, and some people have proven it to be work. So the question is like, well, how does it work? And is there a possibility to make it work in a viable sense? You know, I think it should be explored. And so it's one of those things I've said over and over again. We should not be putting all our eggs in one basket. We should be looking at multiple solutions, and we should be accepting the coexistence of EVs and ICE for many, many decades to come, because as I've just demonstrated, it's inevitable. See you all in the next video.
Brown car guy.
Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please hit the like button and share this video as well if you can. And while you're at it, check out these guys who also sponsor my content. I am deeply grateful to them because it helps me to buy new equipment, put fuel in the cars, and yes, buy a cup of coffee. You can do the same. Just go here or right here on YouTube. Just hit these three little dots down here and click on thanks. Make sure you're signed in first. My content is free, but this is how you can help me keep it that way. I may even send you a gift. Oh, by the way, watch this next.